The summer of 1945 was a time of endings and beginnings. World War II had reached its final chapter in Europe. Nazi Germany had surrendered on May 8th, bringing an end to nearly 6 years of devastating conflict on the continent. But the war in the Pacific raged on. American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands, and the human cost was staggering. Every battle brought tens of thousands of casualties. The planned invasion of Japan, codenamed Operation Downfall, threatened to kill millions, both Allied soldiers and Japanese civilians and military personnel. It was against this backdrop that 3 of the most powerful men in the world gathered in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam in July 1945. They came to decide the fate of the defeated Germany and to chart the future of post-war Europe. But beneath the surface of diplomatic negotiations, another drama was unfolding, one that would change the course of human history. On July 24, 1945, President Harry S. Truman walked across the conference room and casually mentioned to Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin that the United States possessed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Standing just yards away, watching with what he called the closest attention, was British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. What Churchill witnessed in that moment, and what he understood about its implications, would become one of the most analyzed exchanges of the entire war. To understand the significance of what happened at Potsdam, we need to go back to the beginning of the atomic age. The story starts not in 1945, but in the years leading up to the war, when scientists across Europe began unlocking the secrets of the atom. In 1938 and 1939, German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered nuclear fission, the process by which an atomic nucleus splits into smaller parts, releasing enormous amounts of energy. When physicist Lise Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch confirmed these findings and understood their implications, they realized that this discovery could potentially lead to weapons of unprecedented power. The outbreak of war in September 1939 added urgency to atomic research. Scientists who had fled Nazi Germany and fascist Italy to escape persecution began to worry that Hitler might develop an atomic weapon first. One of these scientists was Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, who, along with fellow émigré physicists Edward Teller and Eugene Wigner, convinced Albert Einstein to write a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, warning of this possibility. The Einstein letter, dated August 2, 1939, explained that recent work in nuclear physics made it possible to construct extremely powerful bombs, and that Germany had already taken control of Czechoslovakian uranium mines. This letter would set in motion one of the most ambitious scientific projects in human history. Roosevelt's initial response was cautious. In February 1940, he allocated $6,000 to start preliminary research under a committee headed by Lyman Briggs, director of the National Bureau of Standards. But as the war intensified and Britain became more deeply involved in atomic research, the United States effort accelerated. In December 1941, just one day before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the project was placed under the direction of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, headed by Vannevar Bush. When the United States entered the war, it became clear that industrial-scale facilities would be needed to actually produce atomic weapons. This is where the Army Corps of Engineers came in. In June 1942, the Corps of Engineers began managing the construction of what would become the Manhattan Project. Because much of the early research had been performed at Columbia University in Manhattan, the project took its name from that location, though it would eventually span facilities across the entire United States. On September 17, 1942, Brigadier General Leslie Richard Groves was appointed to lead all Army activities related to the project. Just 6 days later, he was promoted to Major General. Groves was a demanding, sometimes abrasive leader, but he was also brilliantly effective at managing complex projects. He had just overseen the construction of the Pentagon, the largest office building in the world, and he brought that same organizational intensity to the Manhattan Project. Groves quickly established 3 main sites for the project. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, was selected for uranium enrichment facilities. This location would eventually employ 82,000 people and house 75,000 residents at its peak in May 1945. Hanford, Washington, was chosen for plutonium production from uranium reactors. The reactors at Hanford would transmute uranium-238 into plutonium-239, a more radioactive element with a higher possibility of achieving nuclear fission. And Los Alamos, New Mexico, designated Project Y, became the site of the weapons research laboratory. For this crucial position, Groves selected a young theoretical physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer was an unusual choice in some ways. He had no experience managing large projects, and his left-leaning political associations had raised security concerns. Some of his friends and relatives had Communist Party connections, which in the paranoid atmosphere of the time could have disqualified him. But Oppenheimer possessed a brilliant scientific mind and, perhaps more importantly, he had the ability to bring together scientists of different disciplines and temperaments to work toward a common goal. Los Alamos would eventually house 12 scientists who would go on to win Nobel Prizes. It was, without exaggeration, one of the greatest concentrations of scientific talent ever assembled in one place. The work at Los Alamos proceeded along two parallel tracks. One approach used uranium-235, the rare isotope that makes up only 0.7% of natural uranium. Because uranium-235 is chemically almost identical to the more common uranium-238, separating it was extraordinarily difficult. 3 different methods were employed for uranium enrichment: electromagnetic, gaseous diffusion, and thermal diffusion. Most of this work happened at Oak Ridge, where workers didn't even know what they were producing. Security was so tight that the work was highly compartmentalized. A person working on one part of the process had no idea what others were doing. The second approach used plutonium, produced in the reactors at Hanford. Plutonium doesn't occur naturally in any significant quantities, but it can be created by irradiating uranium-238 in a nuclear reactor. The first controlled nuclear chain reaction had been achieved in December 1942 by Enrico Fermi at the University of Chicago, working beneath the stands of the abandoned football stadium. This breakthrough proved that a sustained nuclear reaction was possible, providing the foundation for both the Hanford reactors and the ultimate goal of an atomic bomb. The work at Hanford was staggering in scale. Reactor B, the first large-scale plutonium production reactor, went critical in September 1904. 2 more reactors, D and F, followed in December 1904 and February 1945. But producing fissionable material was only half the challenge. The scientists at Los Alamos had to figure out how to actually make a bomb. For the uranium bomb, they developed what's called a gun-type design. In this design, one piece of uranium-235 would be fired down a barrel into another piece, creating a supercritical mass that would trigger a nuclear explosion. This design was relatively simple, and the scientists were confident it would work. They were so confident, in fact, that they decided not to test it before using it in combat. This uranium bomb would be nicknamed Little Boy. For the plutonium bomb, however, the gun-type design wouldn't work. Plutonium has a different set of nuclear properties that would cause a gun-type bomb to pre-detonate, producing a fizzle rather than a full explosion. The scientists at Los Alamos had to develop a much more complex design called implosion. In an implosion bomb, a sphere of plutonium is surrounded by carefully shaped conventional explosives. When these explosives detonate, they compress the plutonium sphere inward from all directions simultaneously, increasing its density until it becomes supercritical and explodes. Getting the implosion to work required incredibly precise timing and shaping of the explosive lenses. It was such a complicated design that the scientists insisted on testing it before it could be used in combat. This plutonium bomb would be called Fat Man, and the test would be known as Trinity. While American scientists raced to build the bomb, across the Atlantic and in the Soviet Union, other players were watching with great interest. The British had their own atomic program, codenamed Tube Alloys, which they eventually merged with the American effort. British scientists, including Klaus Fuchs and Rudolf Peierls, came to work on the Manhattan Project. But there was another nation paying very close attention to atomic research, and they weren't doing so as partners. The Soviet Union was systematically infiltrating the Manhattan Project with spies. The most important of these spies was Klaus Fuchs. Born in Germany in 1911, Fuchs had joined the Communist Party as a student and fled to England when the Nazis came to power in 1933. He earned his doctorate in physics and became a naturalized British citizen in 1942. When he was recruited to work on tube alloys in 1941, he also began passing information to Soviet intelligence. His motivations, he later claimed, stemmed from his belief that the Soviet Union had a right to know about atomic bomb research and that no one country should have a monopoly on such powerful technology. Fuchs worked on the British atomic program and then came to the United States in late 1943 as part of the British delegation to the Manhattan Project. In August 1904, he was transferred to Los Alamos, where he worked in the theoretical division under Hans Bethe. At Los Alamos, Fuchs had access to some of the most sensitive information in the project. He worked on calculating the energy yield of atomic explosions and specialized in researching implosion methods, the very heart of the Fat Man bomb design. His courier in the United States was a man named Harry Gold, who would meet Fuchs at various locations in New York and Santa Fe to receive documents and information. Fuchs wasn't the only spy. Theodore Hall, a brilliant young physicist who, at 19, was the youngest scientist at Los Alamos, also passed secrets to the Soviets. David Greenglass, an army machinist at Los Alamos, provided crude schematics to Soviet agents. His sister, Ethel Rosenberg, and her husband Julius Rosenberg would later be convicted and executed for their roles in atomic espionage. There were others too, including George Koval, who may have provided specifications for the initiator used in the first Soviet atomic bomb. The extent of Soviet penetration of the Manhattan Project was remarkable and deeply troubling to American security officials when it was later discovered. What's crucial to understand is that by the time of the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Soviet intelligence had been receiving detailed information about the American atomic program for years. Stalin himself had been briefed on the project at least as early as 1942. However, there's an enormous difference between knowing that someone is working on a theoretical weapon and knowing that they have successfully built and tested a working bomb. The Soviets had information, yes, but they didn't know if the Americans had actually succeeded in creating a functional atomic weapon. That uncertainty would play a critical role in the exchange at Potsdam. By the summer of 1945, the Manhattan Project was approaching its climax. At Los Alamos, scientists were preparing for the Trinity test, the first full-scale test of an atomic bomb. The site chosen for the test was in the Jornada del Muerto Desert, a remote area about 35 miles southeast of Socorro, New Mexico. The name, which translates to Journey of the Dead Man, seemed grimly appropriate. Oppenheimer gave the test its code name, Trinity, possibly inspired by a line from John Donne's Holy Sonnet, which opens with the words, "Batter my heart, three-personed God." The test was scheduled for early morning on July 16, 1945. In the days leading up to it, tensions at the test site were almost unbearable. Many scientists were uncertain whether the bomb would work at all. Some worried it might ignite the atmosphere and destroy all life on Earth, though calculations had shown this was essentially impossible. Others feared it might be a dud, wasting years of work and billions of dollars. Weather added to the stress. On the night of July 15th, thunderstorms battered the area. Rain and wind threatened to force a postponement, which would have been psychologically devastating for the exhausted scientists and technicians. But the weather cleared enough to proceed. At 5:29 and 45 seconds Mountain War Time on July 16, 1945, the gadget, as the test device was called, detonated. The explosion exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. Scientists had bet on yields ranging from 0 to 45 kilotons. The actual yield was approximately 22 kilotons, equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT. The fireball reached temperatures of 10,000 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The flash of light was visible for nearly 200 miles. The mushroom cloud rose to between 50,000 and 70,000 feet, far higher than the predicted 12,000 feet. At the base camp, 10 miles from ground zero, the blast wave shook buildings and knocked some observers off their feet. The responses of those present varied. Brigadier General Thomas Farrell, deputy commander of the Manhattan Project, wrote that the explosion was unprecedented, magnificent, beautiful, stupendous, and terrifying. No man-made phenomenon of such tremendous power had ever occurred before. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, turned to Oppenheimer and said simply, "Now we are all sons of bitches." Oppenheimer himself later recalled that a line from the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu sacred text, came to his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The atomic age had begun. News of the successful test was immediately relayed to President Truman, who was in Germany for the Potsdam Conference. The timing was not coincidental. Truman had deliberately delayed the start of the conference. Originally scheduled for June, so that it would occur after the Trinity test. He wanted to know whether the atomic bomb actually worked before meeting with Stalin and Churchill. The success at Trinity gave Truman what he believed was powerful leverage in negotiations with the Soviets. According to some historians, this is why Truman seemed more confident and assertive in his dealings with Stalin at Potsdam than Roosevelt had been at earlier conferences. Now, let's turn to Potsdam itself. The conference took place at Sicilienhof Palace in Potsdam, just outside Berlin. The choice of location was symbolic. Germany had surrendered only 2 months earlier, and Berlin lay in ruins, a stark reminder of the consequences of total war. The Big Three, as the Allied leaders were called, gathered to decide Germany's fate and to establish the framework for post-war Europe. But the Big Three of Potsdam were different from those who had met at earlier conferences at Tehran and Yalta. Franklin Roosevelt had died on April 12, 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. His successor, Harry Truman, had been vice president for only 82 days and had been kept largely in the dark about major policy decisions. He knew almost nothing about the Manhattan Project until he was briefed shortly after taking office. Now, just 3 months into his presidency, he was meeting face-to-face with two of the most formidable and experienced leaders in the world. Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist since the late 1920s. Churchill had led Britain through the darkest days of the war. Truman was the newcomer, untested on the world stage, and he knew it. Churchill's position was also uncertain, though for different reasons. A general election had been held in Britain on July 5th, but the results were delayed to allow time for counting votes from armed forces personnel serving overseas. Churchill came to Potsdam not knowing whether he would still be prime minister when the conference ended. That uncertainty hung over the proceedings. As it turned out, Churchill's Conservative Party was defeated by Clement Attlee's Labour Party. On July 26th, Churchill was replaced by Attlee at the conference. So, the final negotiations at Potsdam were conducted by Truman, Stalin, and Attlee, meaning that 2/3 of the Big Three were new to their positions. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's focus on what happened on July 24th, when Churchill was still at Potsdam. The day began with a plenary session, a formal meeting of all three leaders with their advisors. The discussions covered the usual walks: the administration of occupied Germany, reparations, the Polish border question, and other complex issues that needed resolution. These were contentious matters. Stalin wanted harsh reparations from Germany to rebuild the devastated Soviet Union. Truman and Churchill, remembering how the punitive Treaty of Versailles after World War I had contributed to the rise of Hitler, wanted to avoid repeating that mistake. The atmosphere at Potsdam was notably different from earlier conferences. At Tehran and Yalta, there had been a sense of common purpose, the siege. Allies were united against a common enemy. By Potsdam, Germany was defeated and the cracks in the alliance were showing. Churchill was deeply suspicious of Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. Soviet forces occupied Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and much of Germany. Stalin showed no inclination to allow free elections in these countries, despite previous promises. The Iron Curtain, though Churchill wouldn't use that term publicly until 1946, was already descending across Europe. After the plenary session ended, the leaders stood about in small groups, chatting informally before dispersing. This is when it happened. Truman, acting on a plan he had discussed with his advisors, including Secretary of State James Burns and Secretary of War Henry Stimson, casually walked over to Stalin. With him was his interpreter, Charles Bolin. Stalin had his interpreter, Vladimir Pavlov. Churchill, standing perhaps 5 or 6 yards away, watched intently. Truman's instructions to his staff had been clear. He wanted to appear casual and informal. He specifically told Burns not to accompany him because he didn't want to signal that anything particularly significant was happening. The conversation lasted perhaps a minute or two. According to Truman's own account, he mentioned to Stalin that the United States had a new weapon of unusual destructive force. He didn't use the term atomic bomb. He didn't go into any technical details. It was deliberately vague. Stalin's response was brief and, on the surface, uninterested. He said he was glad to hear it and hoped the United States would make good use of it against the Japanese. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't ask what kind of weapon it was, how it worked, or how powerful it might be. His face, in Churchill's words, remained gay and genial. The conversation ended, and the two leaders walked away to where their cars were waiting. This is where Churchill comes in. From his vantage point several yards away, Churchill had watched this exchange with what he called the closest attention. He knew exactly what Truman was going to tell Stalin because Truman had informed him beforehand. Churchill and his advisors had discussed whether and when to tell Stalin about the bomb. There were arguments on both sides. On one hand, Stalin would find out about it soon enough, either when it was used or through his intelligence services. On the other hand, telling him might prompt difficult questions and demands for information, sharing that the Americans and British were not prepared to grant. In the end, Churchill had agreed that Truman should mention it, but only after a successful test. He thought, as he later wrote, that it was better to tell Stalin they possessed the weapon and intended to use it rather than refuse to share information after Stalin demanded it. It was, Churchill believed, the lesser of two evils. When Truman returned from speaking with Stalin, Churchill was waiting. He immediately asked Truman, "How did it go?" Truman replied with 4 words that would be quoted by historians ever after. He never asked a question. Churchill was certain, absolutely certain, that Stalin had no idea of the significance of what he had been told. In his memoirs, Churchill wrote extensively about this moment. He described Stalin's reaction as being delighted, imagining Stalin thinking, a new bomb, of extraordinary power, probably decisive on the whole Japanese war. What a bit of luck. Churchill believed that Stalin thought Truman was talking about just another conventional bomb, perhaps somewhat more powerful than existing weapons, but nothing revolutionary. Churchill wrote that if Stalin had understood the implications, his reaction would have been obvious. He would have asked to send Soviet scientists to meet with American scientists. He would have pressed for details. But Stalin did none of this. Churchill was so confident in his assessment that he wrote, "I was certain, therefore, that at that date Stalin had no special knowledge of the vast process of research upon which the United States and Britain had been engaged for so long, and of the production for which the United States had spent over £400 million in an heroic scientific gamble." This was Churchill's public position, stated in his memoirs, Triumph and Tragedy, published in 1953. But was Churchill right? Did Stalin really not understand what Truman was talking about? This is where the story gets more interesting and more complex. We now know, from Soviet records released after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Churchill's assessment was wrong. Stalin knew exactly what Truman was talking about. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, one of the Soviet Union's most celebrated military commanders, was present at the conference. In his memoirs, Zhukov described what happened after Stalin returned to his quarters that evening. Stalin told Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov about the conversation with Truman. Molotov reacted immediately. "Let them," Molotov said. "We'll have to talk it over with Kurchatov and get him to speed things up." Igor Kurchatov was the head of the Soviet atomic bomb project. So, Stalin was not surprised. He was not confused. He knew exactly what Truman had told him, and he knew exactly what it meant. His bland, uninterested response was a performance, a carefully calculated act designed to conceal his knowledge. Stalin was playing poker, keeping his cards close to his chest. This raises fascinating questions. Why did Stalin pretend not to understand? What was he hoping to accomplish with this deception? There are several possible explanations. First, Stalin may have wanted to avoid showing his hand. If he had revealed that he knew about the atomic bomb, Truman might have demanded to know how he knew. This could have exposed the Soviet spy networks, which Stalin wanted to keep operational. Klaus Fuchs, Theodore Hall, and the others were still valuable assets. Second, Stalin may have wanted to project an image of strength and indifference. By appearing unimpressed, he avoided giving the Americans the satisfaction of thinking they had intimidated him. In Stalin's worldview, showing weakness or concern was dangerous. Third, Stalin may have been buying time. He knew the Soviet atomic program was years behind the Americans. By downplaying his interest, he avoided a confrontation he wasn't ready for. It's also worth considering that Stalin's response might have been driven by simple pride and stubbornness. Stalin was not a man who liked to admit he didn't know something or that others had achieved something he had not. Throughout his rule, he cultivated an image of omniscience and infallibility. Acknowledging the significance of the American achievement would have required him to admit Soviet inferiority in a critical area of military technology. That was not something Stalin's personality would easily allow. But let's return to Churchill's perspective on that day in July 1945. Churchill believed he had witnessed Stalin's ignorance. This belief had important implications for Churchill's understanding of the post-war situation. If Stalin didn't know about atomic weapons, then the Western Allies had a tremendous, perhaps decisive, advantage. Churchill had always been more suspicious of Soviet intentions than Roosevelt had been. He had described the Soviet system as vile and had compared Stalin to a devil-like tyrant. Churchill saw the atomic bomb as a potential counterweight to Soviet conventional military superiority in Europe. On July 23rd, the day before Truman spoke to Stalin, Churchill had received a detailed briefing on the Trinity test results from American officials. According to Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, Churchill's response was revealing. Brooke recorded in his diary that Churchill said, "We now had something in our hands which would redress the balance with the Russians." Churchill even contemplated telling Stalin that the Western Allies could just blot out Moscow if the Red Army refused to leave Eastern Europe. This was an extraordinary statement, revealing both Churchill's deep concern about Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and his belief that atomic weapons might provide leverage to prevent it. However, Churchill never actually made such a threat, and it's unlikely he would have. Despite his bellicose rhetoric in private, Churchill was too experienced a statesman to make such a provocative statement. But his thinking revealed what some historians have called atomic diplomacy, the idea that possession of nuclear weapons could be used to influence diplomatic negotiations. This concept would shape Western thinking throughout the Cold War, though its effectiveness has always been debatable. Secretary of State James Burns shared some of Churchill's views. Burns believed that having the atomic bomb would make the Soviets more manageable in Europe. However, this calculation proved incorrect. At Potsdam, even after Truman mentioned the new weapon, Stalin didn't budge from his negotiating positions. The disputes over Poland, Germany, and reparations continued. Stalin remained as intransigent as ever. As historian Henry Kissinger later noted, by the end of the conference, it was clear that the atomic bomb had not made the Soviets more cooperative. The bomb might have been a trump card militarily, but diplomatically it proved far less useful than its possessors had hoped. This failure of atomic diplomacy at Potsdam was a preview of things to come. Throughout the Cold War, nuclear weapons would prove to be more useful as deterrents against direct military confrontation than as tools for achieving specific diplomatic objectives. The Soviets, even knowing they were behind in nuclear capability, were not willing to make major concessions just because the Americans had the bomb. This pattern would repeat itself again and again. The bomb was powerful, but its utility in day-to-day international relations was limited. On July 26th, 2 days after Truman's conversation with Stalin, the conference issued the Potsdam Declaration. This was an ultimatum to Japan, demanding unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction if Japan refused. The declaration didn't specifically mention the atomic bomb. That detail remained secret for the time being. The Potsdam Declaration was signed by the United States, Great Britain, and China. The Soviet Union was not included because it was still technically neutral in the Pacific War. Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's surrender, which meant by early August. Japan's response to the Potsdam Declaration was silence, which was interpreted as rejection. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki used the term mokusatsu, which can mean either to ignore or to withhold comment. The Allies took it to mean rejection. This silence sealed Japan's fate. The use of atomic weapons, which had already been authorized, would proceed. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning local time, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay released the Little Boy uranium bomb over Hiroshima. The bomb exploded 1,168 feet above the city with a yield of approximately 15 kilotons. The fireball reached temperatures of several million degrees. Everything within a radius of about 1 mile was essentially vaporized. The blast wave and firestorm that followed destroyed about 5 square miles of the city center. The immediate death toll was somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people, mostly civilians. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to approximately 140,000 as people succumbed to burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. 3 days later, on August 9th, the Fat Man plutonium bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The original target had been Kokura, but cloud cover forced the bomber to divert to the secondary target. The bomb exploded at 11:02 a.m. local time, with a yield of about 21 kilotons. The terrain around Nagasaki, which was more hilly than Hiroshima, somewhat limited the destruction. Nevertheless, about 40,000 to 75,000 people died immediately, with the total death toll by the end of 1945 reaching approximately 74,000. Between the two cities by the end of 1945, more than 10,000 people had died. Many more would die in the years that followed, from cancer, leukemia, and other radiation-related illnesses. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th, 6 days after Nagasaki and following the Soviet Union's declaration of war on August 9th. The formal surrender was signed on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. World War II was finally over, but the atomic age had just begun, and the consequences of what happened at Hiroshima and Nagasaki would reverberate for decades. For Churchill, who was no longer prime minister by the time the bombs were dropped, the events confirmed what he had believed that day at Potsdam. He thought that the atomic bomb had been decisive in ending the war with Japan. Whether this is actually true remains one of the most debated questions in modern history. Some argue that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, and that the bombs were unnecessary. Others contend that without the shock of the atomic bombs, Japan would have fought on, resulting in far more casualties in an invasion. Still others suggest that the Soviet entry into the war was equally or more important than the bombs enforcing Japan's surrender. The debate continues to this day. What we can say with certainty is that Churchill believed atomic weapons would be a decisive factor in the post-war world. In the immediate aftermath of Hiroshima, Churchill wrote to a friend that if he had still been prime minister, he would have used the bomb as leverage to have a showdown with Stalin and force the Soviets to leave Eastern Europe. This was, of course, a hypothetical, but it revealed Churchill's thinking. He saw atomic weapons as a potential solution to the problem of Soviet expansionism. However, Churchill would live to see that his optimism about atomic weapons as diplomatic tools was misplaced. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949, much sooner than Western intelligence had predicted. The United States had estimated it would take the Soviets 10 to 20 years to develop the bomb. They did it in 4. The Soviet success was partly due to their own scientific capabilities, but there's no question that espionage played a crucial role. Klaus Fuchs alone may have advanced the Soviet program by 1 to 2 years. Fuchs was arrested in February 1950 and confessed to espionage. He was tried and sentenced to 14 years in prison, the maximum penalty under British law. He served 9 years and was then released to East Germany, where he continued his career as a physicist until his death in 1988. His testimony led to the arrest of his courier, Harry Gold, which in turn led to David Greenglass and ultimately to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The Rosenbergs were convicted and executed in 1953, one of the most controversial episodes of the Cold War. The rapid Soviet acquisition of atomic weapons transformed the post-war world. The nuclear arms race that Churchill and others had feared became a reality. By the early 1950s, both the United States and Soviet Union were developing hydrogen bombs, weapons hundreds or thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. The doctrine of mutual assured destruction took hold. The world lived under the shadow of nuclear annihilation for decades. In many ways, we still do. Churchill's later years were marked by deep concern about nuclear weapons. When he returned to power as prime minister in 1951, he found the nuclear situation far more frightening than it had been in 1945. The hydrogen bomb particularly worried him. In private conversations and public speeches, he spoke of the terrifying nature of these weapons. In one speech, he said that mankind was as far from the atomic age as the atom bomb was from the bow and arrow. This was a stark contrast to his earlier confidence that atomic weapons would provide security and diplomatic advantage. Looking back at that moment on July 24, 1945, at Potsdam, we can see layers of misunderstanding and deception. Churchill thought he was watching Stalin learn about a weapon Stalin already knew existed. Stalin was pretending not to know, while already planning to accelerate Soviet bomb development. Truman believed he was delivering news that would make Stalin more cooperative in negotiations. None of these expectations were met. The atomic bomb did not give the Western Allies the diplomatic leverage they hoped for. It did not prevent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. It did not spare the world from a dangerous nuclear arms race. What the Potsdam moment did reveal was the beginning of a pattern that would define the Cold War, a pattern of secrecy, espionage, deception, and miscommunication between the superpowers. The atomic bomb didn't solve problems, it created new ones. The weapon that was supposed to end wars made future wars unthinkable in their potential destructiveness. Yet, it didn't prevent conflict, it simply changed its nature. Churchill's observation of Stalin that day at Potsdam was keen, but his interpretation was wrong. He saw what he expected to see, a Soviet leader unaware of the revolution in warfare that had just occurred. What Churchill failed to grasp was that Stalin was a master at concealing his thoughts and knowledge. Stalin had survived decades of brutal political intrigue by never revealing his hand. He wasn't about to start at Potsdam. In the broader context of history, the exchange at Potsdam was significant not for what was said, but for what it represented. It was a moment when the world pivoted from one kind of warfare to another, from conventional to nuclear. It was a moment when the alliance that had won World War II began to fracture into the two blocks that would define the Cold War. It was a moment when the diplomatic landscape changed forever, though the participants didn't fully understand how. The documents and memoirs we have from that day give us multiple perspectives on a single brief conversation. Truman thought it went well, that he had informed Stalin without revealing too much. Churchill thought he had witnessed Stalin's ignorance, and that the West now had a decisive advantage. Stalin knew he needed to accelerate Soviet bomb development. Burns, Truman's Secretary of State, believed the bomb would make the Soviets more cooperative. Admiral William Leehy, Truman's Chief of Staff, was skeptical that the bomb would have much military value at all. Everyone was reading the situation through their own lens, shaped by their own assumptions and agendas. What nobody fully appreciated at the time was how fundamentally nuclear weapons would reshape international relations. The old rules of diplomacy and warfare no longer applied. You couldn't conquer a nuclear-armed opponent without risking your own annihilation. This reality would gradually dawn on leaders in the years that followed, but at Potsdam, it was still too early to understand the full implications. Churchill, for all his brilliance and experience, didn't fully grasp it either. He still thought in terms of military advantage and diplomatic leverage. The idea that nuclear weapons might make war itself obsolete, or at least suicidal, hadn't fully sunk in. The Trinity test in New Mexico had taken place just 8 days before the Potsdam conversation. The scientists who witnessed it understood immediately that they had created something unprecedented. Oppenheimer's quote about becoming death, the destroyer of worlds, captures the magnitude of what they had accomplished. But translating that scientific and philosophical understanding into practical political implications was difficult. How do you incorporate weapons that can destroy entire cities in seconds into normal diplomatic calculations? How do you threaten to use such weapons credibly without appearing either bluffing or monstrous? These questions would occupy strategists and politicians for the entire Cold War. At Potsdam, in July 1945, these questions were just beginning to emerge. Truman and Churchill were still thinking in World War II terms, about defeating Japan and containing Soviet expansion. The full weight of the nuclear age hadn't yet settled on their shoulders. Stalin, with his spies embedded in the Manhattan Project, may have had a better sense of what was coming than his Western counterparts realized. The human cost of the atomic bombs, the hundreds of thousands killed at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the many more who suffered from radiation sickness and cancer in the years that followed, was not something that could be adequately considered in the abstract at Potsdam. Truman and his advisors knew the bombs would be devastating, but the actual reality of nuclear warfare was something that could only be understood after it happened. The photographs and testimonies from Hiroshima and Nagasaki would shock the world and change how people thought about war. But at Potsdam, those images didn't exist yet. The bomb was still theoretical in its effects, even after Trinity. Churchill's role in all of this was complex. As one of the architects of British participation in the Manhattan Project, he bore responsibility for the creation of atomic weapons. As an observer at Potsdam, he witnessed the moment when the atomic age became public, or at least semi-public, knowledge. As a Cold War leader in the 1950s, he would grapple with the implications of living in a nuclear world. And as a historian and memoirist, he would shape how we remember and understand these events through his detailed accounts. The accuracy of those accounts has been questioned by historians with access to Soviet archives. We now know that Churchill's confident assertion that Stalin didn't understand what Truman told him was incorrect. But Churchill's writings still provide valuable insight into how Western leaders were thinking at the time. His belief that Stalin was in the dark tells us something important about Churchill's own assumptions and about the information available to him. He didn't know about the extent of Soviet espionage. He didn't know that Stalin had been receiving reports on the Manhattan Project for years. From Churchill's perspective, based on the information he had, his interpretation made sense. It was wrong, but it was logical given what he knew. This is perhaps one of the key lessons from the Potsdam moment. Intelligence matters. Understanding what your adversary knows and doesn't know matters enormously. The Western Allies thought they had a secret that would give them leverage. In reality, the secret wasn't as secret as they believed. This pattern would repeat throughout the Cold War. Both sides would overestimate the security of their secrets and underestimate the effectiveness of the other side's intelligence gathering. The result was an arms race driven partly by real threats and partly by misunderstandings and overreactions. Another lesson is that new weapons don't necessarily provide the political benefits their possessors expect. The atomic bomb was militarily powerful, but translating that military power into diplomatic advantage proved difficult. Stalin was not cowed by the bomb. He was concerned enough to accelerate Soviet bomb development, but he wasn't willing to make significant political concessions. The bomb's existence changed the strategic landscape, but it didn't give the Western Allies control over Stalin's decisions regarding Eastern Europe. Power, even overwhelming military power, has limits in international relations. The conversation at Potsdam lasted perhaps a minute or two. It was deliberately kept brief and vague, yet it has been analyzed and reanalyzed for decades. Historians have written books about it. Why? Because it encapsulates so many of the themes of the mid-20th century. The transition from World War II to the Cold War, the advent of nuclear weapons, the beginning of the superpower rivalry, the role of intelligence and espionage, the limits of military power in achieving political objectives. All of these themes are present in that brief exchange between Truman and Stalin, with Churchill watching from a few yards away. If we could transport ourselves back to Sicilienhof Palace on that afternoon, in July 1945, what would we see? We'd see three men, each powerful in his own right, each carrying the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. Truman, the accidental president thrust into leadership at a critical moment in history, trying to project confidence while navigating waters he had never expected to enter. Stalin, the ruthless dictator who had survived purges, war, and decades of brutal political struggle, now calculating how to respond to this new challenge. And Churchill, the old lion of British politics, victor of a terrible war but about to be voted out of office by his own people, convinced he was witnessing a turning point in history. They were all right that it was a turning point, but not in the ways they expected. The atomic bomb didn't end war. It didn't give the West the leverage Churchill hoped for. It didn't even remain an American monopoly for very long. What it did was change the stakes. It made the Cold War cold because a hot war between nuclear powers was too terrible to contemplate. It created a precarious peace built on the threat of mutual annihilation. It spawned an arms race that consumed vast resources and brought the world to the brink of destruction several times. Churchill lived until 1965, long enough to see much of this unfold. He saw the Soviet Union acquire the bomb. He saw the hydrogen bomb developed. He saw the Cuban Missile Crisis bring the world to the edge of nuclear war. His optimism about atomic weapons from 1945 had long since faded. In his later years, he spoke more about the dangers of nuclear weapons than about their benefits. The weapon that he had once thought would provide security had become a source of existential dread. The story of what Churchill said when Truman told Stalin about the atomic bomb is really a story about perspective and knowledge. From Churchill's vantage point, watching Truman and Stalin, he saw one thing. From Stalin's perspective, receiving information he already had and calculating how to respond, the moment meant something quite different. From Truman's perspective, trying to project strength and prepare for the coming showdown with Japan, it was yet another thing. And from our perspective, 79 years later, with access to documents and archives that none of them had, we can see layers of complexity and irony that they couldn't perceive. History is often like this. People act based on incomplete information. They interpret events through the lens of their own assumptions and experiences. Misunderstandings compound, secrets shape decisions, and only much later, if we're lucky enough to have good historical records, can we piece together what really happened. The Potsdam Exchange is a perfect example of this. What seemed clear to Churchill at the time, Stalin's supposed ignorance, was actually a carefully constructed deception. What seemed like a diplomatic advantage, telling Stalin about the bomb, was actually revealing information to someone who already knew it. What seemed like a way to end the current war quickly, the atomic bomb, was actually the beginning of an even more dangerous era. In the end, what did Churchill say when Truman told Stalin about the atomic bomb? According to Churchill's own account, after watching the exchange, he asked Truman, "How did it go?" And Truman replied, "He never asked a question." Those 7 words, Churchill's question and Truman's answer, sum up the moment. They capture Churchill's intense interest in Stalin's reaction. They capture Truman's interpretation of Stalin's response as indicating ignorance or lack of understanding. And they capture what would become the historical puzzle for decades to come. Did Stalin really not ask a question because he didn't understand, or because he already knew the answers? We know now that it was the latter, but Churchill went to his grave believing the former. In his memoirs, published years after the event, he was still certain that Stalin had no special knowledge of the Manhattan Project. Churchill was wrong, but he had no way of knowing he was wrong. Soviet archives wouldn't be opened for decades. The extent of Soviet espionage wouldn't be fully revealed until after the Cold War ended. Churchill wrote his history based on what he could see and what he had been told. It was incomplete, but it was the best he could do with the information available. This is perhaps the final lesson from Potsdam. History is written by people who often don't have the full story. They do their best with what they know. Churchill was a brilliant observer and a gifted writer. His accounts of World War II are invaluable historical documents. But even Churchill, with all his experience and insight, could be mistaken about crucial facts. He misread Stalin's reaction because he didn't know about the spies in Los Alamos. He overestimated the diplomatic value of atomic weapons because he was thinking in pre-nuclear terms. He couldn't fully anticipate how nuclear weapons would reshape international relations because that transformation hadn't happened yet. The conversation at Potsdam between Truman and Stalin, with Churchill watching, lasted less than 2 minutes, but its implications would unfold over decades. The atomic age that began with Trinity and Hiroshima would define the rest of the 20th century. The Cold War that emerged from the ruins of World War II would last for 46 years. The nuclear arms race would produce tens of thousands of weapons. The existential threat of nuclear war would hang over humanity for generations. All of this was contained, in embryonic form, in that brief exchange in July 1945. Churchill's interpretation of that moment, recorded in his memoirs, became the standard understanding for many years. It was only when Soviet archives became accessible that historians could correct the record. Stalin knew. He had always known. His bland response was theater, a performance for an audience that didn't realize it was watching a show. Churchill fell for it, Truman fell for it, and most of the Western world fell for it for decades. Stalin, the master of deception and survival, had fooled them all. In the grand sweep of history, this deception mattered, but not in the way Stalin probably intended. Yes, it concealed the extent of Soviet intelligence gathering. Yes, it prevented awkward questions about how Stalin knew so much. But it didn't change the fundamental strategic reality. The United States had the bomb first. They used it on Japan. And then they faced a choice about whether to try to maintain a monopoly or to work toward international control. They chose monopoly, partly because they underestimated how quickly the Soviets could catch up. And that choice, more than anything said or unsaid at Potsdam, shaped the nuclear age that followed. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only nuclear weapons ever used in warfare. In that sense, the horror of what happened in August 1945 has served as a deterrent. Every generation since has lived with the possibility of nuclear war, but also with the memory of what nuclear war actually means. That memory, preserved in photographs, testimonies, and historical records, has helped prevent the use of nuclear weapons for 79 years and counting. It's a thin thread on which to hang the survival of civilization, but it has held so far. Churchill's observation of the Potsdam conversation was just one small moment in a vast historical drama. But small moments can be revealing. They can tell us about the people involved, their assumptions, their knowledge, their blind spots. Churchill was brilliant, experienced, and perceptive, but even he couldn't see everything. He couldn't see into Stalin's mind. He couldn't see the reports flowing from Soviet spies to Moscow. He couldn't fully see into the future, to the nuclear arms race and the Cold War that would follow. None of them could. They were all making decisions in real time, with incomplete information, under enormous pressure, trying to shape a world that was changing faster than they could fully comprehend. That's the human reality behind the history books. Leaders are just people, trying to make the best decisions they can with the information they have. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're right for the wrong reasons, or wrong for understandable reasons. Churchill was wrong about Stalin's reaction, but his error was based on a logical interpretation of the available evidence. Stalin was right to conceal his knowledge, from his perspective, but that deception created its own problems by preventing any possibility of genuine dialogue about atomic weapons control. The world that emerged from World War II and from that moment at Potsdam was shaped by these decisions and misunderstandings. We live in that world still. Nuclear weapons still exist. The threat of nuclear war has not vanished. New nuclear powers have emerged. The weapons have become more sophisticated and more numerous. The basic dynamic of nuclear deterrence, mutual assured destruction, remains in place. All of this traces back, in part, to those few minutes at Sicilienhof Palace when Truman mentioned a new weapon to Stalin. And Churchill watched, certain he was witnessing Stalin's ignorance of the atomic age. He was witnessing Stalin's performance, but Churchill, despite all his experience and insight, didn't realize it was a performance. That's the power of good intelligence on one side, and the limits of understanding on the other. So, when people ask what Churchill said when Truman told Stalin about the atomic bomb, the answer is revealing, but also incomplete. Churchill asked Truman how it went, and received the reply that Stalin never asked a question. But the larger answer is that Churchill said many things, in the moment and in his later writings, all based on his interpretation of what he had witnessed. He believed he had seen Stalin learn about the atomic bomb. He believed the West now had a decisive advantage. He believed this advantage could be used to contain Soviet expansion. He was wrong on all counts, but his belief shaped his actions and his historical accounts. And those accounts, in turn, shaped how generations of people understood this crucial moment in history until Soviet archives finally revealed the truth. The truth was more complex and more ironic than Churchill knew. The great democratic statesman had been deceived by the totalitarian dictator. The West's most closely guarded secret was already known to their adversary. The weapon that was supposed to provide security sparked an arms race instead. The moment that seemed clear was actually filled with hidden layers of meaning. That's often how history works. What seems obvious at the time becomes questionable with distance. What seems simple becomes complex. What seems like an ending becomes a beginning. The conversation at Potsdam was an ending of sorts, the end of World War II's Grand Alliance. But it was also a beginning, the beginning of the Cold War, the nuclear age, and a new kind of global tension that would last for decades, and whose effects we still feel today. Churchill's words to Truman after the conversation, just 4 words, "How did it go?" capture a moment of curiosity and concern. And Truman's 4-word reply, "He never asked a question," seemed to provide reassurance. But beneath those 8 words lay a world of complexity, deception, knowledge, and ignorance that would take decades to fully unravel. That's the real story of what Churchill said when Truman told Stalin about the atomic bomb. It's a story not just of words spoken, but of what was understood, what was misunderstood, what was hidden, and what would only become clear much later, when historians could finally piece together the full picture from records on all sides of this momentous historical divide.